Yay! Hello, I'm Charlotte from Climate Salad, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn Diversity Health Check. And this is a really wonderful topic close to my heart because it's an area I'm really passionate about with Preeti, who's going to guide us through best practice and a presentation to help with all organizations, whether you're a startup or scale up or corporate venture, or an investor, on how to get this right, because it is absolutely pertinent to the success of your business, but incredibly important to the climate impact movement as well. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians on the land of which we meet. For me, that's the Gubbi Gubbi people. Wanya Nullam, welcome. And I pay homage and respects to their continuous connection to country, land, and sea. And I recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. And in this week of Reconciliation Week, I also support a voice to Parliament, and we'll be definitely voting yes to that one step forward. Preeti, I will hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And before I start as well, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. I'm dialing in from Wongal country of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. I'm going to share my screen. Just let me know if you can all see it. Is it
yes, it's not in presentation mode yet. That's all right. You'll get it in there.
There you go. All right, perfect. So I want to really make this as conversational and as engaging as possible. We're going to walk through a few different things, and there's going to be exercises. So if you can, put on your cameras and also have the chat open so that you can type in answers, or maybe if it's a small enough group, we can just unmute and be a part of the conversation, because I think that's really important. So a little bit about NiceTo. We're all about representing the underrepresented in startups and tech. And so our primary goal is to change the funding equation and see a more inclusive, equitable, and diverse tech and startup ecosystem. So we're doing a number of initiatives. And the way I've even structured this presentation is the way we are thinking about approaching the issue of representation in the ecosystem. So join along. First of all, what is DEI? I think this term gets thrown around a lot. There are so many different takes about it, but I think it boils down to a simple truth of achieving a sense of belonging and entitlement as well for everyone, regardless of identity. And identity can take a number of different shapes. So before we get started, I'd love all of you to just type in the chat box a few things that you think define your identity. It could be your job, it could be anything about your background, but I'd just love to see a mix of who's in the audience. Let me make sure I've got chat open. I'll actually start. So there you go. Thank you, Charlotte. For me, I'm Indian, I'm a woman, my pronouns are she, her, and I consider myself a hybrid of a founder and an investor. Scientist, migrant, millennial, thank you. Single mum, business owner, neurodiverse, so Irish and Australian, love it. Anyone else? Migrant mum, Australian born, Asian female, Gen Z, investor. Amazing. Love it. So I think what's important to recognize is that we're all so much more complicated than what we generally see. 1 second. So the first point is unlearning binary and superficial thinking. the world has proven, especially with the advances of new technology, that different is the new normal. We need to learn and celebrate our differences and not just the similarities. And as per the chat, you can see that we're all very intersectional, complex individuals. And at the end of the day, we're just human, which means there are a few base instincts that we all rely upon. One thing I wanted to show you is the binary thinking is something that has come through years of systems and colonization as well. And it's embedded in everything we do, including our technology and the culture that surrounds us. So if you actually Google sophisticated clothes, this is what comes up. And if you can see, it's a sea of white. And these things are embedded in our everyday life, and we need to really start thinking beyond that. We need to start reflecting on our own identity and our principles. So I love that, Matthew, you've said a privileged, straight, white male millennial who cares about diversity. So I think regardless of our background, we all have our own biases and privileges. And what we need to do is start by recognizing our own biases and privileges. So in terms of my own privilege, I think it's multifold. First of all, I have an incredible family structure support system that supports me. And I think that is a privilege I lean into very heavily that others don't have, and how I can pass on some of that privilege is by being a support structure and system for people who don't have that. So that's something that I think about constantly. Does anyone want to maybe unmute yourselves and just talk, but like what sorts of privilege do you have that you use to help and support others?
Hi, I'll go. So I've worked my way up to having the power privilege to sit on boards and advisory boards that actually can shift money to being a force for good, and also being a woman of color and whatever other labels others want to label on me. I know who I am, but yeah, I have that power privilege. It's come through lots of pain and hard work, but then that means I have to represent a lot of people, and leaving no one behind is the motto that I have to bring to that table. So that's one example of a power privileged.
I love it. And I love that you recognize that it has been a lot to get to that point, but now you're using it for the greater good. That's incredible. Thank you, Samin. And thank you, Charlotte, as well. And who else? Thank you, Imchi.
I'll jump in as well. And I think similar to Zarmeen and Matthew Forrest, I mean, people typically refer to me as an older Matthew Forrest. I have a lot of privilege piled on me being successful and fairly senior and a little bit of power. And I'm lucky enough to be in situations where, whether it's a panel or speakers, to make sure to suggest that people are represented across a wider range than might be the default. And similar to Charlotte, I think it's really important to use my network to connect people to other people that they might not have connected to on their own. So I think I'm very lucky to be able to use networks and experience to try to do my part.
Wonderful. And I just love hearing this. I think actually networks is one of the most critical components of finding a job, finding investment, getting your next big client. So I think that's really important. Anyone else want to jump in? So when we're talking about bias and privilege, I think it's important for us to reflect and think about any areas that they both can operate in, and they both can help mitigate the barriers that some others face. So for example, when we're thinking about bias, think about your hiring process. Think about any time there's even a meeting and like people's opinions are heard and put forward. And when you're talking to like even service suppliers, think about those conversations and think about how you're letting your bias influence who you select as a service provider as well. So think about bias from multiple perspectives and like really stop and reflect what's going on. And another exercise that I found to be really useful is, as a team in your organizations, have an open discussion about bias whenever it comes to key decision making. So what that means, and I know VCs across Australia are actually employing this strategy already. So when they come to their IC meeting, before they actually hear the pitch, they'll say, here are the things that I'm biased about, so you're aware, and then they go ahead and present, and then it's like a blind voting that happens. So I think those sorts of things are really important. And this is a much more personal thing than it is professional. So you can go through as many bias training workshops and things like that, but I think making it a habit to recognize and learn about your own biases and privilege and how you can pay forward the privilege, it's personal and it's about yourself and reflection. And then there's a tool here, Diversio, which flags cultural sensitivity and unconscious bias. If you're looking for real change in the organization at scale, this is definitely a tool to look into. When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of organizations think of it as an obligation. In fact, it's actually a huge opportunity. There's so much potential. So even with the lens of climate, if you think about it, the next wave of refugees is going to be from climate. They're going to come from all over the world. We need them to be part of the solution. So involving diverse perspectives, diverse voices, really just getting someone with a different lens to you adds so much color and depth to what you're trying to solve. It improves the culture if you have an ecosystem that is conditioned to accept diversity and one that's inclusive. So it's like, I can keep talking about this. I think it ticks so many boxes. There are so many studies which shows it also adds to the economic bottom line, whether you cut it by gender, whether you cut it by race, regardless of the way you cut it, the bottom line is that when there are teams that are non-homogeneous, it does improve performance. So I think that's something we need to condition ourselves to talk about. And we're not doing diverse hires for the sake of diversity. We're doing it because it's actually going to improve our performance. Oh, hang on. That's weird. Okay. So when we're looking at it, think about why it matters to you, your organization, and the ecosystem you're in as well. And this is really important because it's a long-term effort. It's not short-term. So we need to connect the dots essentially between your purpose, your vision, and your strategy. And diversity needs to be one of the building blocks that's embedded to help it filter all the way through. Because so often I see like checkbox exercises where it's diversity is just one part of the equation. It's not. It's like similar to climate, we should be thinking about diversity holistically. So it needs to be a proactive commitment that comes from yourself, your organization, and also the ecosystem around you. If you're not able to influence all those levels, definitely start with yourself and then start with whoever is in your sphere of influence. The other thing we see is that there are so many initiatives that are like individual or siloed. So you'll see in organizations, there are diversity task forces. And the fact is that they don't get to talk to one another, talk to the other teams. And they might be in charge of one particular initiative at a time, but it doesn't filter through to the entire organization. So think about how you can do it as a combined and consistent effort. And part of that is creating an environment that is inclusive, that avoids perpetuating harmful stereotypes, racism, and bias. So if someone says something that is harmful or disrespectful, make sure you call them out, but do it in a respectful way, because ultimately we want the conversation to be ongoing. We want people to understand as well. So I think there's a respectful way of calling these things out.
Could you give an example of how to do that in a respectful way?
Yeah, so I've had an example where someone made a very sexist comment against a woman, and basically it was in a wider team environment, and the person who was the target of this was very uncomfortable but didn't speak up. And so what I did is I spoke to this person afterwards, and I'm like, did you realize that you said this and it could have been construed in this way? So it's more about opening the conversation up. And he was actually taken aback, firstly, that he was called out. But secondly, that I think from the sense I got, he meant it as a joke, but it was really poorly intended. And he didn't realize the impact of it. And so that opened the grounds for the conversation, and he actually went and apologized to her afterwards. So I think pointing it out like that, instead of going, you did this, you're black marked forever, is probably the best way to approach it. Has anyone else had any examples?
Yeah, I've had many examples. It's happened to me, as well as it actually provides the people that are different, or just different, don't have a certain white privileges. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
We then have a very good superpower, if you like. So we can see the invisible, and it's very hard to see the nothing is overtly in your face. It's always this invisible sort of a fight, and it's a lot of it is unconscious, but then a lot of it is also about it could be something to do with alpha. Just any alpha is agnostic. It's across females, it's gender agnostic to be an alpha type.
Yeah.
And sometimes people just want to put someone else down or ridicule someone in jest. We've got the Australian culture as well, that we bag people out.
Yeah,
but now
yeah.
it's getting at a stage where, it can happen on any sort of table where, you know, you make fun of someone that's, you know, of Indian origin, if you like, you play a lot of cricket or Indian curry or something that, you know, makes it feel a bit more uncomfortable. Was it really required in that conversation? You're putting some additional, you know, biases within the group, and then you feel excluded. So yeah, you cannot, as I said in the comment, you cannot expect the person, the female who is experiencing it, or the other person, it can be a male, doesn't really matter, to be speaking out. That's not what allyship is about. Allyship is about actually really listening to make sure that if I was that person, how would I feel? And the empathy is pretty important, but you can't really empathize because the people that have the privilege that have never not had the privilege can't see it. So, you know, so it's just that respectful way to say, well, you know, bringing it out outside, and I've done it at the board level, that I, you know, and that takes also bravery, right? To say, well, I don't think we should be talking about, you know, something about migrants. Migrants are hard workers. Well, yes, and we should hire a migrant because they will really work hard compared to so it's like, okay, are we talking about modern slavery now here or what? So yeah, it's just about being really conscious and listening carefully and acting for the person that won't be able to speak up, because there's a power dynamic.
Absolutely.
There's always a power dynamic with even money and, you know, startups and investors. Definite power dynamic. That's why you need diverse teams in the investment team to be able to speak up against the other investor on the table, right? Because there's an equal power play. If there's two investors speaking and there's a multiple lot of startups, then it's up to me to say, hey, sorry, I don't agree with you, and call it out. And I'm very happy to do that openly in a respectful way.
Yeah, I think you've definitely mentioned so many points that are so valid. Like, first of all, stereotypes and perpetuating them, whether they're harmful or not. Like, saying someone's a hard worker is on the surface considered a good thing, but as you mentioned, like, what are your expectations of that? I think that's really important to think about. And then you're right, like, I think victims these days, with open conversations, they're getting more courage to speak up, but allyship always helps. I think having people there to back you up and even be heard. For example, if you're in a meeting room with multiple stakeholders and there's someone constantly talking over someone else, you can be the ally in that meeting room and go, actually, I think so-and-so made a great point. Let's listen to them. So yeah, there's definitely multiple layers to it. And being an ally, that's probably a whole other separate training.
I thought I'd just mention one I found was useful is that I guess leading with curiosity or questioning, because I was in a situation where we, you know, hired a contractor to organize conferences and stipulated that we really want to make sure that most of our suppliers are from supply nations, so certified Indigenous businesses. And there was a comment about the photographer that was like, "Oh, well, you know what they're like." Like, what, photographers? What do you mean? What, like, who is like? And made them really uncomfortable by asking that question and probing. It's like, did you want me to just go along with your stereotypes of a race? Like, what do you mean by that? How explain to me? So I guess, yeah, that maybe it wasn't as respectful, but I feel like the questioning in that was, you know, and making them question what they were saying as well can also work.
Yeah, you're right. I think anytime, like, part of that being respectful is not giving them answers, it's actually making them introspect and question what they've done. So I think that's a huge part of it. Anything else before I move on to the next slide?
Freddie, I was lucky enough to lead two major multinationals. And the first thing I learned was, don't think of it as a machine, think of it as an organism. Now, as soon as you do that, you start to think in systems. And I found that females were much more adaptable to systems thinking than the male linear thinking. So if you expose females, and that's one rule, have the female in the system end of the business, because by nurture, they are natural systems thinkers. Do you get what I mean by that? They have to be a project manager, a human resource development manager, organizer, all at once. So they lend themselves to systems thinking. Where it failed was where the female, and this is anecdotal, it's not a rule, but where I saw it fail was when the female wanted to be accepted in the alpha group and began to tell the jokes and then of course eventually was very hurt by the return jokes. Do you see what I mean? So providing females can see their absolute advantage in systems in this century, that's it. It's networks and it's systems. And I think if the organization is led as an organism, those things and the attributes are recognized, and then both the same remuneration and the same status and the same cars, well, you don't get that, but all of the privileges are the same. It works, and the guys change.
So I think you've brought up some very interesting points. So if we even like remove the genders from it, right? The gender archetypes have been there for years, for centuries. And we as humans try to do things to fit in. But I think what we all need to remember as individuals is to default to what are our own strengths, and also understand what our weaknesses are, so we can work on them, or we can actually just focus on the strengths. So I think if we approach it in that way, I think it's going to be a better solution for all of us. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is that a lot of the role definitions, or like the gender stereotypes, have been defined by years of systems. So we need to move away from that and stop perpetuating them as well in a lot of ways. So for example, I did a program for women, and we were being told to act in a way that was steeped in years of misogyny. That was really, really problematic. It wasn't recognizing anything about us as individuals. And so when we're saying these things, or when we're running organizations, we need to be really conscious of that, and then bring it back to the human and each individual around what their strengths are. And for example, let's say you observed this of someone in your team, the way to approach that conversation would be around, okay, like, these are your strengths, focus on this. But incredible Johanna, 4th female pilot in Qantas. That is incredible. So talking about systems, I think it's important that we unlearn current systems and processes. So it's about reviewing entire processes, language, terminology, hiring processes, meetings, leaderships, OKRs, everything. As I mentioned, it's something that needs to be embedded from the get-go. And if you haven't done that from the get-go, I would actually recommend that you take a step back to actually unlearn and then relearn what is the right way and make it a consistent effort. And in doing so, use some tools for system thinking. One tool that I've linked already in this presentation is the iceberg method, which looks at what's on the surface and then keeps going below the surface to understand how we can actually create change. And as I mentioned, like, look at what's urgent versus what's a nice to have, so that when you're thinking about really fundamentally changing these systems and processes, you're thinking about what can have the biggest benefit. And there's another tool here which looks at cultural sensitivity and unconscious bias, and it actually filters through your entire organization setup and process, in particular in terms of hiring, retaining talent, and looking at performance reviews. So it's a great tool to check out afterwards. And then this one I am so passionate about. Learn to encourage open communication. I think we've kind of spoken about this already. And even from my own experience, like, there are so many times in the corporate world, I really wish I had been given an environment where I was allowed to speak up. As Zomi mentioned before, it's hard for the victim to speak up, and it's important for allies to speak. But unless we create a culture that allows open communication where people feel safe and not judged, it's never going to change. Like, if we're in environments where we feel safe, we don't feel judged, we don't feel blamed as well, and that's on both sides of the equation, it's never going to be an open conversation. So I think that's something really important to remember. Does anyone have any tips or anything that they've implemented in your own organizations to encourage open communication? And the other thing I'd mention is, like, making a mistake and not being blamed for that, and like being given an opportunity and a chance. I think that's a huge part of it.
What I try to do is, when I'm speaking with people in meetings, people that feel as though they don't have a place to speak, is I just really try and push the point. There are no silly questions, there are no stupid ideas, and I'll come up with my own just to make myself look, just try and bring that humility and give everybody a chance to sort of say, well, if she came up with that, I think I've got a better idea than that. And I just wanted to mention that in terms of, going from sexism, now that I'm 61, going on 62, my next barrier that I'm pushing through now is ageism. I just thought I'd share that.
Oh my God, absolutely. Like, this is the thing, when you look at identities, there are so many things that define us, and I think we need to stop thinking about individual or binary identities and start thinking about, like, humans as the complex individuals they are and what they bring to the table, especially when you're thinking about high performance culture.
I think there's an interesting moment happening right now in the social media space, where a couple of days ago, funny enough, an intern at one of the streaming services sent out a blank message to thousands of people. And the response has been really nice on two levels. Number one, organizationally, the organization immediately apologized, said, funny enough, it was the intern, but don't worry, we're taking care of them. And I think that's a really important moment of saying, we're not going to throw them under the bus. This is a learning moment. We're taking care of this person to make sure that they can learn as an individual. It's part of their career development, but also culturally, I think that's a really important inflection moment. And the kind of nice follow-on with that is if you search for Dear Intern on Twitter right now, you'll find hundreds of examples of people sharing, hey, intern, kind of like Joanna said, hey, intern, I've done something way dumber than that. Don't worry, you'll be fine. It gets better. So I think that's kind of a nice example of some real clear communication to the individual, but also to the company and to the culture of what matters organizationally.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think it really shows how it filters down from the environment, the organization, and the individual.
Freddie, can I give you two quick ones that I learned?
Yeah, absolutely.
Through life. Every system is perfectly designed to generate the output it creates. So whichever output you have, the system has been designed to do that. In other words, the culture has been designed to do that. So who leads the culture? There it will tell you who's got to change. The second thing is, blame is never apportioned to somebody who makes a mistake unless help hasn't been sought or help hasn't been supplied.
Yeah, you're right. But even before, like, having that open culture where they are willing and able to get that help, I think is a critical piece, because in a lot of organizations, even that step isn't accessible. And the tool that I've mentioned here is Pluto, which is all about getting meaningful data. So they have structured their data collection in a very different way, which allows people to write more detailed responses and feedback, which allows you to gather more information. So if you don't have the time to do listening groups, think about using a tool like this to do it at scale. Merit, very contentious. So merit has been used on both sides. And often what I find is that overrepresented groups use merit to say the case for diversity doesn't exist. But actually, merit needs to remain as the yardstick for hiring, promotions, and key decision making. What we need to think about is how you define merit, because there could be a lot of unconscious bias hidden within your merit process. And to give you an example of this, let's say you're a startup pitching to an investor. Traditionally, like, what the startup ecosystem is geared to is hearing the Silicon Valley pitches, who are very over promotive, loud, and like saying they can do everything and they can do it tomorrow. And that's what investors are geared for. That's what they're looking for. They're about making returns, and these come across as confident in terms of promising to deliver those returns. Now, what we need to do is take a step back and really start to dissect it. It's a huge process. It's about like the due diligence process that follows. It's about asking the right questions and getting the right answers from that question. Also, like unconsciously, what happens with investors is they ask men more opportunity-based questions and women more preventative or risk-based questions. And this is actually a huge hurdle, because if you get a preventative or risk-based question, you're put on the back foot when you're answering. And so what happens is you're defensive rather than presenting your opportunities. And so what happens to the funding? It gets cut down or you don't get it. So it's a huge learning process. And this is not just in startups and pitching, it's also in hiring. It's also in meetings and interviews. So it stems to a lot of areas. So really think about your yardstick for judging merit. It's one of the hardest things to do unless you're basing it on pure numbers. But as we know, like no OKR is just pure numbers. There are so many things that go into what defines merit.
Preeti, I think some of the problem here is actually providing the opportunities, equal opportunities for people to actually gain merit.
Yeah,
I see this all the time. Like, look at if somebody sends a resume, you know, and they put in an anglicized name, they're far more likely to get the interview. Look at what Charlotte just said about, you know, the Indigenous photographers. They're not given the opportunity to gain the merit, to be able to show the merit, to be able to move up and onwards.
and that comes back to the conversation around equity, right? Like not everyone is given fair opportunities. So the best demonstration of equity is so equality is giving everyone a pair of shoes that they can wear. Equity is giving everyone a pair of shoes that they can wear that actually fit. So it's about how do you give the opportunities to people that help them get to that same level. And a great tool, an Australian tool, and she's also raising investment at the moment, is Scene Culture. But already in the pilots, they've been able to reduce turnover and improve performance and give you like different criteria to help judge merit once someone's already in the organization. So when we're thinking about diversity, like we've spoken about it, everyone needs to be part of the solution. Like while task forces are really clever, I mean, like they're great at driving forward initiatives, we need to make sure it's not just people from underrepresented backgrounds on task forces doing jobs that they don't get merit for, and they're underappreciated and undercompensated for it. So we need to really make sure that we're thinking about how everyone can be a part of the solution. And we need to give people social accountability and like rely on their want to do good to drive change forward in an ecosystem. And a little tool I really love is Ally or Ally, which sends out DEI surveys through Slack. So that's a good pulse check to have. And like I'll talk about this later, but having transparency in measurement and showing the initiatives and making change is another great way to get everyone engaged as part of the solution. Yeah, and Scene Culture is very clever. So they do have a open angel syndicate if anyone's looking to invest. So yeah, as I mentioned, measurement is really important. So look at unlearning measuring just activity and instead measure impact. And so I'll give you an example of this. So for us here at NiceTo, it's all about changing the funding equation and seeing more underrepresented people get access to more capital. And so what we're doing is we're doing an ecosystem health check across the Australian startup ecosystem, starting with founders and looking at their access to funding to try to measure what the state of the ecosystem is at the moment. And then we'll be working with investors as well as other ecosystem players to try to create the change. And the crucial impact we're measuring is how much that funding equation changes, instead of measuring all our individual activities, because we recognize that we're not the only ones that are going to be solving this or playing a part in solving this. And we also know that it's going to be a sum of multiple different activities. And at the end of the day, it's really the impact that matters. And so if you would like to learn more about that project, please get in touch, because we're looking for people to be part of it as distributors. We're looking for sponsors, and anyone that just really wants to support or give their opinion on the way it should be shaped, because I think it's something that impacts all of us being in this ecosystem. Any questions?
Only that we want all of this, all of these wonderful links and tools.
So I've listed those tools and more, as well as resources. And these resources in particular are great for things like terminology and to improve your own knowledge of what to say, what not to say, and all of that. And then throughout the presentation, you would have seen there are links to articles and things like that that have informed and shaped some of the thinking.
Amazing. It's I'll see if we can even like create a bit of a resource with you, Preeti, so that all members can access this, because I know that when this was this workshop, I did get quite a few people saying, oh, I can't make it, but I really want to learn more about all of these things. I guess what I found really useful as part of this was that it's a journey. Like we can always learn and improve and do more and more and more on. It's not something where you finally arrive at. I'm good. I got this.
You're absolutely right. Like it's long term. It's not like something that's going to happen overnight. And this is why we've put this framework of unlearning and learning over the top of it, because it is a continuous journey. The yardstick for what good looks like can change. And sorry, I've just lost my voice a little bit. And that's happening because more people are like coming out of bubbles that they've been living in and realizing the experiences that have affected them and getting the courage to speak up, which is bringing new issues into light, which I think is a fabulous thing, because we're, as a society, learning how to educate ourselves, react, and respond. Which, and like, to be honest, is such a huge area. There are so many blind spots all of us still have. And so really the simple thing we can all do is unlearn and relearn continuously.
Absolutely. And just a small one to the community, you know, whether Climate Salad should be publicly supportive of Yes to the Voice campaign. And I was like, oh, you know, that's something we could do. And then speaking to our First Nations founders, it was like, you can do so much more. What about a reconciliation action plan? What about this? What about that? And it's, you know, it's asking those questions and learning and continuing on that journey. So thank you so much for helping us all on that journey. There's always more we can do. There's always more we can unlearn and learn. Preeti is part of the community. You can grab her on Slack. You can grab her on those details right there. But she will generously also share the presentation, and the recording will go out to you all as well. So thank you so, so much. Really great Lunch and Learn. And thank you so much for all the commentary and participation from everyone on the call today as well. So this has been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone that came and participated as well. I think we can always present something, but having rich experiences and having your backgrounds being part of the conversation is really, really important. And if there are initiatives that you think need to change in the startup and tech ecosystem, please do approach us, tell us, give us feedback. We're open for that. And if you want to work together, we're 100% open to that as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, Joanna makes a great point. The ages thing does come up. It's like, yeah. So good on you for being a pioneer in different fields, from being first, you know, one of the first female pilots to now, you know, bucking the trend on startup ecosystem. You don't always have to be, you know, wearing a hoodie straight out of university. But or not even going to university. So thank you so much, everyone on the call. And I hope you're all becoming champions of DEI as well. Thanks so much, Preeti.
Thank you. Thank you all.